Welcome back, everybody, to the Epic Wonder Woman Deep Dive. In this episode, we are going to be tackling Wonder Woman's appearances during the Silver Age of comic books, which was a really negligible, uncomplicated period of comics history where nothing all that important happened. Now, I freely admit that the Silver Age was unfortunately not my area of expertise when I started researching for these videos. It just happened too long ago that I wouldn't have read these books growing up, and also in that weird liminal time period of comics publication where it's really hard to find copies of these issues. Which is a bit of a shame, because one of the things I've noticed while reading this stuff is how much of Silver Age minutiae actually informs a lot of the stuff that's put out more recently in ways that you might not expect. But that's because we're missing the middle step of the journey, the whole massive chunk of connective tissue that fills in the unfamiliar bits and pieces that slowly, over time, turn this character into this character. Comics in general tend to be married to the status quo, to the archetypal routines that serve these characters. They always tease big, sweeping, dramatic changes to things for shock value, but the fact is that completely reinventing a character overnight tends to be the exception rather than the norm. Genuine changes to the nature of a long-running iconic character don't just happen overnight. They're usually more incremental. They come in bits and pieces with 1,000 cuts over time instead of an instant shot to the head. That was a really gruesome analogy. It's more like boiling a frog slowly instead of throwing them into the fire. Basically, it's hard to see how a character might be transforming before your eyes on an issue-by-issue or even an arc-by-arc basis. It's only when you step back and examine the entire wide tapestry of their stories that you can see just how much things have changed over time and why. And that's exactly what we will be doing today. Just as an ongoing reminder for these series of videos, I will be discussing various women's issues and themes about feminism in these Wonder Woman comics to the best of my finite abilities, since, as we've covered, Wonder Woman's primary story is that of her being a feminist superhero. If that's not something you're interested in hearing about, too bad. Unfortunately for you, you are compelled by Aphrodite's lasso to sit and listen to these essays. There is no way for you to click out or close your browser. I am so sorry, we are in this together forever. When we last left off, it's 1947, Professor William Moulton-Marston had passed away at the age of 53. For a couple of years, even while Marston was dealing with his health, the Wonder Woman books were being ghostwritten by Marston's assistant Joy Hummel. So technically, even if no one knew about it at the time, a woman did get to directly write on the Wonder Woman title pretty early on in its publication history. So that's kind of cool. And then it didn't happen again for a really long time. But still, the guy who officially took over as the lead writer of Wonder Woman and Sensation Comics after Marston's passing was Robert Kanigher. And right off the bat, we really need to stress that this one guy will go on to write a bajunk ton of Wonder Woman comics for a gidonkulous amount of time. Robert Kanigher would headline this comic for 22 years. That's an absurd number of issues more than anyone else, including Wonder Woman's own creator. I assume there must be comparable instances of this, but off the top of my head, I can't think of anyone else who put in that much work on one single character for so long, and yet most people nowadays never really associate his name with Wonder Woman. It's also not as if Kanigher wasn't doing anything else at the time. He created staple DC Comics characters like Sergeant Rock and Black Canary, and you know, a little known figure you might have maybe heard of named Barry Allen. Considering how Barry Allen's emergence as DC Comics' new Flash is commonly credited as the starting shot that heralded the Silver Age of comics, I think this indicates just how foundational a presence that Robert Kanigher was to the many iconic trappings of the Silver Age. And that includes, of course, very many elements of Wonder Woman that we fans might recognize today. Kanigher introduced the concept of Diana being empowered by the Greek gods instead of just being a very exceptional Amazon princess. He gave her the power of flying, sort of, instead of relying on her invisible plane. He introduced wacky Silver Age concepts like Wonder Girl and Wonder Tot, which would notoriously turn into the notoriously confusing character who I love anyway, Donna Troy. He created Nubia, who's getting a very big push in modern comics as a worthy counterpart to Diana herself. He's the one who made Mer-Boy Egg Foo, which really surprised me at least. Like, yikes, I was sure that William Marston would have had to have been the guy who made something like Egg Foo, but no, it was Kanigher. So I wanted to preface this whole section with the undeniable fact that Robert Kanigher had a huge part in shaping Wonder Woman and her world through the years, maybe just as much as someone like William Moulton-Marston. The fact is that as far as these long-running, serialized characters go, their original creators probably won't end up being the biggest influence on their legacy, and that's just how it might go. Now, whether Mr. Kanigher wielded his massive influence over this fledgling iconic character in a way that did her justice over the years is a different question with some different answers. As I mentioned last time, there's this general... I almost don't want to call it a consensus because, let's be honest, not enough people actually have enough of an opinion about 1950s Wonder Woman for there to be a consensus on it. But let's say that the series has a slight reputation for going a wee bit downhill after Kanigher took over. And not just in terms of like not being as fun or interesting to read as the book used to be, but also in terms of making Wonder Woman less radical, less of an empowered feminist character than she used to be. Now, on the one hand, I will say that to me personally, it's a little hard to see where exactly Kanigher's Wonder Woman was all that much worse of a book than Marston was. Like, just being real here, all of these old vintage comic books are about the same level of narrative quality to me. They're all kind of wacky and cartoony with a bunch of wacky cartoon plots about alien invasions and giant people, and they all kind of blend together as far as general readability goes. I'm interested in these stories for what they have to teach me about how Wonder Woman as a character has evolved over the years, but if I just showed y'all a bunch of panels side by side, I don't know that anyone would be able to easily tell which ones were written by Marston and which ones by Kanigher, especially during the earlier issues when H.G. Peter was still doing all the artwork. Along those lines, it's also difficult for me to tell where Kanigher might be all that much more super duper offensive or sexist about Wonder Woman than Marston was. Just being completely honest here, all of these old-timey comics come across to me as very old-timey and outdated about all kinds of stuff. Like, I do see how Kanigher's stories can often be pretty disempowering and cringy, but as I've talked about, Marston was also pretty sexist in his way. Now, y'all saw my first video, you know that I appreciate what Marston was doing and I at least get what he was going for, but there are a lot of ways where someone might look at his portrayal of Wonder Woman and be like, wait, is this actually empowering? How is this actually empowering? A lot of reviewers will bring up that Kanigher seems to be more obsessed with injecting romantic drama into Wonder Woman's life, and it's true that later issues of Sensation Comics in particular tried very hard to sell themselves as romance books. It's also ostensibly true that Kanigher does make Diana simp for a whole bunch of male characters especially hard, and we will get into that, but like, I think we've covered pretty well that Marston also spent a whole lot of panel space on Wonder Woman's love life and had Diana mooning pretty hard for the first man she ever met, constantly and forever, which, at least on the surface, doesn't feel all that much better. So again, for me personally, it's hard at first to see how Kanigher might have done Diana dirty in ways that Marston hadn't. It's hard to see the clear, sharp, dramatic line that a lot of other readers apparently saw where the Wonder Woman series changed from the formative feminist work that it was in Marston's hands into something much less empowering just from this changing of the guard. But Just because the difference is a bit harder for me to see doesn't mean that I don't see it at all. It doesn't mean that the difference isn't actually there, merely that we might have to dive a little bit deeper to find where it's hidden in the nitty-gritty of Kanigher's storytelling. Lucky for us, this is the Wonder Woman Deep Dive series, so let's get to it already. So I said earlier that it's hard to tell the difference between Marston's and Kanigher's issues just from looking at them, but there's actually a secret trick to doing so. Let me give you all a hint. Which of these issues contain Etta Candy? Which of them feature the Holiday Girls? Now, let's be clear that Kanigher didn't write Etta and her friends out of these books entirely. She appeared in 18 whole issues of his, 22-year tenure. But most of those appearances were in the first 10 or so issues when Kanigher first came onto the book, so it's not as if she was appearing on a steady basis once a year or something. Etta's gone entirely from Wonder Woman comics from issue 48 in 1951 to issue 117 in 1960. Kanigher basically left this character out of the book for 69 issues over 9 years, and then only used her for 3 more issues after that, and never again during his remaining 8 years on this book. Etta Candy would basically not appear in comics again until the 80s, near the end of the Bronze Age. Compared to when Marston was writing the Holiday Girls into just about every issue of his Wonder Woman series, yeah, you could say this was a bit of a change. But how did this change affect Diana's portrayal? There was still a significant female presence in the book. The Amazons appeared very frequently, and Kanigher even kept Paula von Gunther around, at least for a couple dozen issues longer than he did Etta. Did taking the Holiday Girls out of Wonder Woman comics really have that big an impact on these stories? Well, yeah, kinda. Look, the Amazons filled a lot of panel space in Kanigher's issues, but other than Diana's mom Hippolyta, they were basically background filler with no actual personalities and never actually did anything. I don't remember a single one of their names or if any were ever given. Now, Etta and the Holiday Girls were not like spectacularly three-dimensional characters or anything, but they filled a lot of roles for Diana, roles that were suddenly missing from this book. They joined Wonder Woman on her missions, kicking a lot of ass right alongside her. They were friends of Wonder Woman and Diana Prince, giving her a different kind of camaraderie than the type that she'd find with Steve or her mom or different age versions of herself. More on this later. And finally, they were her students. They were receptacles for her empowering example and gave Marston an excuse to have Diana give a bunch of patented speeches on love and sexual liberation. Well, more of an excuse than usual anyway. It's not like the professor ever needed all that much prompting to start preaching radical notions in his book. Without all those radical notions, though, Diana slowly but inevitably became less and less of a teacher figure and more of a... well, I'm not really sure what she did anymore in the 50s and 60s. The war was over, but Diana Prince was still with military intelligence. She didn't hang out with anyone in Man's World other than Steve. Ares wasn't doing anything important. Wonder Woman didn't bring villains to Reform Island anymore, and she didn't have her pack of feral college girls that she could turn to and go, "Don't let men dominate you, dominate them first," anymore. So what does Wonder Woman do all day now, if not all that? Look, I highly doubt that Kanigher was deliberately trying to make this book worse or anything by shuffling out Etta Candy of all things. On the contrary, I'd guess that he thought he was making a notable improvement instead. The fact is that Etta is a bit of an acquired taste, and Kanigher probably just didn't share Marston's sense of humor about this clownish character that joked about eating candy to everyone within earshot at every given opportunity for all eternity. But Etta's absence from this book, among other things, kind of cut to the heart of what started to make Wonder Woman feel less radical, progressive, empowering, feminist, whatever we want to call it, during this era of comics. No matter how much of a surface similarity that the Silver Age might have with the Golden Age on the monkey cheese cartoony level, at the end of the day, Kanigher was not Marston, and the readership could tell. He wasn't really interested in having Wonder Woman turn to the camera to spout maxims on womanhood or transforming your enemies with love instead of hatred. You'd be hard-pressed to tell if he was interested in those maxims at all. Strangely, Kanigher also never has Wonder Woman use her magic lasso for anything other than as a really strong rope. She never uses it to compel anyone to do anything with the power of Aphrodite like she used to. I really think that at some point Kanigher just forgot that the lasso had this power. So his version of Wonder Woman was still very powerful and did a ton of physically powerful stuff all the time to save the day with all the OP physics-defying nonsense that were characteristic of these old comics. But I think that readers of the time were slowly discovering a notion that has since become a bit more standard for contemporary audiences, which is that being physically superpowered on its own doesn't necessarily make a character empowered or empowering. A literally strong character, man or woman, isn't necessarily a character with strong writing. Now, did Marston imbue Diana with that kind of abstract strength in a way that Kanigher didn't? Am I saying that Robert Kanigher's Wonder Woman was basically the 50s and 60s version of Kate Beaton's self-deprecating, strong female character? Again, I don't think it was quite as simple as that. I think that Kanigher really did love Wonder Woman and tried to build her up in his own way, including even giving her a souped-up, even more mythological version of her original origin story, which, now that I think about it, probably didn't help alleviate the impression of her being a completely different person than the person that Marston created, because she kinda literally was. So for the first nearly 70 issues and 10 years of Kanigher's work on Wonder Woman, he did stick to the Golden Age origin story pretty much verbatim. We even get to flash back to the Amazon's whole original backstory to see the same scenes unfolding with a little bit of added flavor. Now, the usual introductory soundbite for Wonder Woman up to this point was that she was as lovely as Aphrodite, as wise as Athena, with the speed of Mercury and the strength of Hercules. This was her equivalent to the whole faster than a speeding bullet, stronger than a locomotive thing. But these were just poetic designations at this point. They were figurative. The original flavor Wonder Woman didn't literally have the power of the gods. All of the Amazons were superpowered thanks to their training and lifestyle, and Diana just happened to be the best Amazon of the Amazons. They had a whole contest about it. Certainly Diana had a whole lot of potential right from her creation, but we never see her being granted any special powers other than her special gear like the golden lasso and the invisible robot plane. Alright, jump forward to 1958 and artist Harry G. Peter, who has drawn Wonder Woman comics for 16 years, finally leaves the series he pretty much co-created and passes away in the same year. Artists Ross Andrew and Mike Esposito are brought on to replace Peter on Wonder Woman issue number 98, and right off the bat, things are very, very different. We get to see a mega truncated version of the Amazon's backstory and a kind of coked up version of the original contest to determine their champion in Man's World, with every contestant wearing a Diana mask so Hippolyta doesn't choose her own daughter unfairly, and then a very heightened version of Diana's original rescue of Steve Trevor, with her using her super powerful breath to blow open Steve's parachute and then to blow them all the way to America. Welcome to the Silver Age, Diana. It just gets more coked out from this point forward, which is saying something considering what we've already seen in the Golden Age. Okay, several things to notice. One, this is the first time Wonder Woman ever actually flies, or technically glides on air currents. Just like how Superman didn't originally fly but just leapt tall buildings in a single bound, Diana couldn't originally fly either. She usually just called her invisible plane with her mental radio to take her everywhere. Here's the first time she's shown to have the ability to glide on air currents, somehow, which is something she'll be doing until the 80s post-crisis reboot. Sidebar, this ability is of course what the DCEU's Wonder Woman 1984 film is referencing and homaging when Diana finally learns to fly. Which You know, as flawed as that film was, I always thought this was a very charming nod to a very charming vintage ability. I really like this scene. Secondly, Hippolyta sure is looking a bit different, isn't she? I don't really know what the thought process was behind this complete visual overhaul. What, was anyone complaining about Wonder Woman's mom not looking blonde enough? But again, this is what she'll look like until the 80s. In modern times, major artistic changes in comic book series happen pretty often, whether it's in between arcs or issues, or if we're unlucky enough, even in between pages. This was pretty rare back in the old days though, and as far as I can tell, Kanigher basically used this first major artist swap on this title as an excuse to soft reboot Wonder Woman's whole storyline. Wait, so you guys know about the multiverse, right? I don't have to explain the concept of the multiverse to you. That shit has been everywhere in genre media nowadays. If you somehow don't know what a multiverse is, don't worry about it for now, just try to keep up. So anyway, there wasn't some huge elaborate announcement about this at the time, but comics historians will end up citing Wonder Woman issue 98 as the first true appearance of the Silver Age Wonder Woman, aka the Wonder Woman of Earth 1, as opposed to the Wonder Woman of Earth 2 that the original Marston Wonder Woman wound up getting consigned as. Yes, I know they ended up naming the Earth that came earlier as the second Earth. I know. Essentially, Kanigher decided to take this opportunity with this new reboot to put his own mark on Diana's origins. So in issue 105, we find out that when Diana was born, 4 of the Greek gods, Aphrodite, Athena, Mercury, and Hercules, actually visited her at her cradle and gifted this Wonder Baby their iconic powers. So now, instead of it just being a catchy slogan, Wonder Woman literally has the power of being as beautiful as Aphrodite, as wise as Athena, swifter than Mercury, and stronger than Hercules. Which, hey, not to knock on simple Amazon training or anything, but being blessed with powers by the gods themselves is undeniably a bit of a glow-up. That said, I always thought it was a bit unfair for Diana to compete in the contest to become the Amazon's champion in man's world when she clearly, obviously, always had superpowers that they didn't, which, yeah, it kinda was. Like, it doesn't matter if you're all wearing masks to make the contest fair if one of you has super speed and the others don't. Most writers from here on out will mostly just politely ignore this fact, and Kanigher himself will start to seed in the notion that Diana was always destined to become some sort of great force for good in the world, while not so subtly mentioning the actual contest less and less through the years and hoping people don't notice that it was super rigged in Diana's favor. It wasn't until 2017 that God-tier Wonder Woman writer Greg Rucka rejiggered things so that Diana was born without superpowers, but received her godly gifts as a prize after winning the contest fairly and becoming Wonder Woman on her own strengths. Which, yeah, that's probably better. Mythological sidebar. I still do like this scene here of the gods granting powers to the infant Diana though. Kanigher clearly drew inspiration for this moment from the iconic christening scene from the fairy tale of Sleeping Beauty. Yeah, you recognize it now, right? A bunch of magical beings gather around a baby princess and grant her magical gifts like beauty and grace and goodness. Now, this fairy tale actually draws its source from several elements of Greek mythology. Remember how the evil, bad Angelina Jolie fairy was upset that she wasn't invited to the parties, and so she ends up cursing the princess instead? Well, this is drawn from the inciting incident of the Trojan War. The mortal king Peleus was getting married to the sea nymph Thetis, and all the gods were attending the wedding and giving out some radical gifts, except for Eris, the goddess of discord, who wasn't invited, and angry at not being invited, throws the apple of discord into the crowd, which snowballs into a whole lot of shenanigans. So right off the bat, there are some strong mythologically iconic elements of this origin story for Wonder Woman, and that's only scratching the surface. Backtracking a bit, when Moulton-Marston came up with the original concept of Queen Hippolyta sculpting Diana from clay and Aphrodite bringing that baby to life, he was already drawing a whole bajunk ton of inspiration from Greek mythology, the most conspicuous of which was probably the story of Pygmalion. Pygmalion was a sculptor who made a statue so beautiful and perfect that he fell in love with it, and he prayed for Aphrodite to help him find a wife who was just like his statue. Aphrodite knew what he was actually asking for and brought his actual statue to life as a real woman and, okay, let's assume they lived happily ever after. Comic book Hippolyta's motives were obviously not the same as Pygmalion's, but we can easily see how Marston was influenced by this classic story of the goddess of love bringing a stone statue to life in order to help someone who was longing for love. Again, Kanigher's additions to this origin also draw heavily from mythological themes, but he seemed to be more inspired by the story of Pandora when he came up with this scene of the various gods bestowing intrinsic gifts upon Diana. Pandora's myth is, well, it's pretty misogynistic in a lot of ways. Never let it be said that Christianity was the first sexist mythology, because the Greeks got them beat pretty bad as far as villainizing women goes. Pandora was created by the gods as the first woman, as a punishment to mankind for Prometheus giving them fire. And when I say created, I mean Hephaestus literally crafted Pandora from clay in the shape of the goddesses. After which, several of the other gods would grant Pandora various gifts. Athena would teach her weaving and crafts, Aphrodite gave her beauty and a longing, and then Hermes would instill in her crafty words and a deceitful nature. Because Hesiod, who wrote this myth, had issues. This whole concept of the various gods coming together to bring Princess Diana into the world with all these different attributes of these gods would really take off in George Perez's reboot. Like, he goes to town on the thematic connections between Diana and Pandora. But we can clearly see where Kanigher has laid the groundwork for that. Sure, the whole lovely as Aphrodite, wise as Athena, swifter than Mercury, stronger than Hercules catchphrase description had been around since Marston, but Kanigher is the one who made the actual connection that 3 out of these 4 gods match the ones that gave Pandora her qualities, and that, oh hey, Diana's made of clay just like Pandora, and so he lined it up so that Diana's figurative qualities became literal blessings granted by the gods upon the young princess in her cradle. Now, I want to draw attention to the fact that humans getting made out of clay and earth and stone was a huge theme in Greek mythology. Marston and Kanigher caught on to the story of Pygmalion and Pandora as very appropriate thematic inspirations for Wonder Woman's origin, but those individual stories in themselves merely reflect the wider mythological motif that people are just made from earth. The very first human beings were made by Prometheus from clay, sometimes with help from Athena. After the Great Flood wiped out all people but Deucalion and his wife, he created more people by taking stones, the bones of Mother Earth, and throwing them over his shoulder. These stones literally became the humans who would propagate the world from that point forward. I'm sure there are people who don't know mythology all that well who are like, boy, it sure is strange that Wonder Woman is made from clay. Doesn't that make her a golem or something? Doesn't that make her less alive, like a robot? Doesn't that make her less human? Boy, I cannot stress enough that human beings were made from Earth in Greek mythology. It is a constantly recurring theme, along with themes of metamorphosis and transformation. It's actually hard to be more in line with Greek mythology than by having your hero be sculpted from clay and given life from the gods. You know, there was a time where I kind of took it for granted that everyone appreciated just how very much Wonder Woman's origin story tied neatly into uniquely Greek mythological motifs. But it turns out that maybe various people, including people who are in charge of writing certain Wonder Woman stuff, apparently maybe have a much shallower understanding of mythology and just think that every hero is a child of a god or something. Which actually ends up making me even more appreciative of writers like Marston and Kanigher and Perez, who do actually seem to have a much more thorough and well-rounded understanding of mythology. Anyway, Wonder Woman is made from clay, and this never changes or ever gets needlessly fucked with. The end. You might also be wondering what exactly Hercules' relationship to the Amazons and Hippolyta is now. considering that he tricked and enslaved them in the Golden Age Marston canon, but here now is just casually walking into Diana's room to give her his blessings like a kindly uncle figure. Well, hold that thought for now. We'll revisit this when we get near the end of Kanigher's tenure. The other significantly major thing that Kanigher started to do in his run was to feature stories of Diana as a younger teenager. In the same issue that revamps her origins, we get to see this younger Diana have her own adventures. In the next issue, she's officially referred to as Wonder Girl, and from this point forward, about half of an issue of a Wonder Woman comic would be about Wonder Woman fighting crime in man's world, and the rest of the issue would be about Wonder Girl doing her thing back on Paradise Island, or often in the oceans near Paradise Island. I did not exaggerate when I said that Wonder Girl was a significant thing in these books. For almost 20 issues of its run, if you were buying Wonder Woman comics, you were reading about Wonder Woman and Wonder Girl. Now, Marston had also written a couple issues of stories about a younger Diana's adventures on Paradise Island, but Kanigher very obviously yoinked this ongoing concept of Diana having been Wonder Girl from the Superboy comics that had been very popular for many years at this point, which featured the adventures of a young Clark Kent in his hometown of Smallville. This is something we'll start to notice about Kanigher, namely that he was always keeping an eye on the trends of the time and had a certain penchant for gimmicks in his stories. Which isn't necessarily a cynical thing. As a publisher, you always want as much of your comics and your intellectual property to sell to as large of an audience as possible. If younger versions of adult characters are shown to attract younger readers, there's no shame in chasing that trend. DC still attempts the same sort of strategy today, still occasionally publishing stories of Diana as a young girl or Batman as a teenager in book series intended for younger audiences, all of which is just the modern version of Kanigher's shtick. That said, Kanigher definitely took this concept a bit further than people probably expected. In issue 122 in 1961, we got to see adventures of Diana as a fucking baby named Wonder Tot, which... okay, fine, there had also been stories about Super Baby before now as well. But from then on, the book kinda just threw out all pretense entirely and started making Wonder Woman had adventures together with Wonder Girl and Wonder Tot at the same time, so, you know, with herself as a girl and as a toddler. Now, you might ask, how did this happen considering that they're all the same person? The popular nerd misconception these days is that this happened by paradoxical time travel, as in one or another of the Dianas traveled through time to meet their older or younger selves. But that's actually not the case. You see, in issue 124, Wonder Woman is going through her fan mail and talking about how all the readers wanted to see the impossible story of her meeting up with Wonder Girl and Wonder Tot. Oh right, by the way, this sort of meta in-joke was a thing that Kanigher would do a lot over the years as well, up to and including writing himself into some of these issues. Because we're long past the point of treating any of this seriously. So, Queen Hippolyta tells Diana that this isn't impossible and that Wonder Woman can team up with Wonder Girl and Wonder Tot through photoshopping. You see, by splicing together film footage of Princess Diana at different ages, and then later dubbing over the footage, they could make it seem as if all three of the Dianas are in the same scenes, going on adventures, getting in and out of trouble together. So whenever we, the readers, see Wonder Woman with Wonder Girl and Wonder Tot in this comic, which is going to be very often, we're actually seeing a movie that Diana and her mom edited together in Adobe Creative Suite or something. So this is the part of the video where a more expensive, well-funded YouTube channel would edit in different aged versions of me into the shot to make a joke with. Let's just pretend I did that here and then move on. And then later on, they would just dispense with this film splicing pretext entirely and just like act as if the Wonder family did just always all exist together all the time. Like, here they all are sleeping in their house like it's a normal thing they do all the time, and yeah, at some point everyone just forgets that these are all supposed to be the same person. In this scene, they think that the older Wonder Woman might have died in a crash, and they're like, "Oh no, mommy, don't cry. Hang on, now go check on the wreckage. Girl, that's you. Future you might have just died. You might have just witnessed your own impending demise. But no, the dynamic between Wonder Woman, Girl, and Tot basically becomes that of older and younger sisters all getting into some wacky family shenanigans together instead of it being like... I mean, let's not lose the thread here that they're all actually Diana. Here's younger Diana having boy troubles and older Diana giving her younger self some sisterly advice about it as if... Isn't this you? Aren't you talking to you about your issues? Very infamously, this dynamic of the Wonder family all acting together like a full-fledged family unit instead of the same person CGI'd into the same scene at different ages will lead to the creation of Miss Donna Troy, who infamously may or may not be the most confusing character in all of comics. As we can see, the poor girl's already not off to a great start. In 1964 and 65, writer Bob Haney would put together a super team of younger sidekick heroes like Robin, Kid Flash, Aqualad, and Wonder Girl, and they would go around fighting crime on their own. Which is great. These Teen Titans would go on to become one of DC's most enduring properties, because getting a bunch of teenagers with attitude together to save the world basically prints money. Except for the wee problem that Wonder Girl was actually just a younger Wonder Woman instead of the separate person that she's being treated as here. People generally blame Bob Haney for mistaking Wonder Girl as Wonder Woman's kid sister, but like, it's really not his fault. He clearly, read these Wonder Woman issues and very understandably arrived at the very logical conclusion that you cannot possibly blame him for arriving at, which is that this must be Wonder Woman's younger sister, because that's literally exactly how the comics depicted her. Anyway, it wasn't until Teen Titans issue 22 in 1969 that they kinda sorted out this discrepancy by coming up with a new origin and a new identity for Wonder Girl, where instead of being a younger Diana, she was Donna Troy, an orphan that got rescued by Wonder Woman when her family died in a building fire, and then adopted by Queen Hippolyta and given powers by the Amazon's purple healing ray. So that would be origin number 2 of the, I believe 6 total origins that Donna would end up having by the time of this recording in 2022. Stay tuned. So back to the Wonder Woman book. We kind of have to take a moment here to focus on something I alluded to earlier, which is the amount of boy troubles that Wonder Girl and Wonder Woman would be experiencing. We already saw that Kanigher tried to rebrand Sensation Comics as a romance book before the title was cancelled in 1953. He would continue to make romantic drama a big part of Wonder Woman's life, with the usual refrain of Steve Trevor trying to get with Wonder Woman all the time while she brushes him off, while Diana Prince tries to get Steve to notice her instead. And as I mentioned, this is not dramatically different from what Marston had already been doing before Kanigher, on the surface. A lot of this will come down to narrative nuance, which is always pretty subjective, but in my subjective opinion, Marston having Wonder Woman reject Steve all the time even though she really did like him, reflects Marston's overall feminist approach to everything he did in the book in a way that didn't quite come across in Kanigher's approach, even though they were portraying the same overall beats. What I mean is that, from the perspective of William Marston, this old white guy who died in the 40s, one of the worst things a woman can do is to get hoodwinked by a man because she really likes him, to be so smitten with a powerful, dominating man that she'll let him walk all over her. In Marston's comics, we see one poor lovesick woman after another who brings on her own suffering because she's just so in love with someone that she can't see the proper, powerful, womanly way to act instead. Wonder Woman helps these women, but she also has to watch out for this danger herself. Hence, she can't be Wonder Woman if she also lets herself be overtaken by love for a man, no matter how nice of a man he is. This is Aphrodite's law, but it's also her own law, her own conviction for herself. And I've talked about how Marston's approach is actually not completely super unproblematic, but it nonetheless feels like something that strengthens this character and her ideals. For Kanigher, though, Wonder Woman refusing to marry Steve no matter how much he asks feels more like drama. Drama for the sake of drama and not much else. Which, let me preface, is again not the worst thing in the world. Every writer tries to throw drama and conflict into their books to try to keep people invested, to try to get them to buy the next issue. And Kanigher was an industry veteran who knew what he was doing in regards to serialized soap opera dramatics in the same way that Marston knew what he was doing in terms of preaching to women about women's liberation. So while Marston's Wonder Woman was usually pretty consistent about why she wouldn't get with Steve and stuck to those reasons pretty consistently, there could be a bajillion interchangeable reasons that vary issue by issue as to why Kanigher's Diana and Steve couldn't just seal the deal. In one issue, Diana might give the standard excuse of, "Oh, Steve, I can't be with you as long as my services are needed by the world." And then in another, she might be like, "Well, Steve loves me as Wonder Woman, but he treats Diana Prince pretty shabbily, so I can't really love him as Wonder Woman unless he loves Diana Prince more. But wait, if he loves Diana Prince more, that means he would never be happy with Wonder Woman because we're so different." Then in another issue, she just can't marry Steve because she can't choose between him and her other suitors, a Mer-Man and a Birdman. Yeah, so early on over in Wonder Girl's portion of stories, we had been introduced to Mer-Boy. Well, a DC wiki tells me that his name is Rano the Mer-Boy, but I think the books mostly just call him Mer-Boy. Anyway, Mer-Boy becomes a very recurring character as Wonder Girl's love interest. And by love interest, I mean he mostly just pesters her to hang out with him while she's training, and then he gets into a bunch of trouble that she has to save him from, because apparently the waters around Paradise Island are just filled with wild nonsense. It seems very strange at first that Kanigher made Wonder Girl's love interest a Mer-Boy, but then it's not as if he could have just given her a normal high school sweetheart like they did with Lana Lang over at Superboy's books. If you have to toss a heteronormative love interest at a younger Diana who grew up on an island where no men can go, I guess he would have to live in the ocean. So right from the outset, Wonder Girl would wade through the same sorts of romance hijinks that Wonder Woman would, with the same sorts of dramatically unsolvable situations that her adult self would cycle through. Like, "Oh, I really like Mer-Boy, but I can't ever truly be with him because blah blah blah." In fact, the adult version of Mer-Boy, called Mano the Mer-Man, shows up very soon in the adult Wonder Woman stories and immediately butts heads with Steve Trevor for Diana's affections. Very minor sidebar, put a small mental bookmark on Kanigher coming up with his very own non-Steve Trevor romantic interest for Wonder Woman and kind of doing everything he can to make this original character Do Not Steal into as big of a presence in Wonder Woman's world as he can. Kanigher might be the first to do this, but he would not be the last. By modern times, Wonder Woman will have gone through a veritable train of prospective OC love interests, with whom their respective creators tried their damnedest to make a lasting impression with. A spoiler alert, for whatever reasons, very few of these characters will end up making all that much of a lasting impact. In any case, this status quo of Wonder Girl and Mer-Boy dancing around their affections, and then Steve and Mer-Man trying to get Wonder Woman to notice them would go on for a really long time. There's like 30 issues of this. In fairness, there was a sort of puppy dog charm to these stories, especially near the beginning. This was a whimsical world where these silly kids made goo-goo eyes at each other and no one never really got hurt and everything usually ended with smiles and jokes and it was a sitcom in a way that only could happen in the 60s. But holy god, did Kanigher milk this shit for far more than it was worth. So many issues end with Diana turning to the camera and going, "So who do you guys think I should choose, Steve or Mer-Man?" Just in case we weren't completely certain yet that this was just a gimmick to churn out the same never-ending drama with. And then, when Kanigher had milked the Wonder Woman Steve Mer-Man love triangle enough, he turned back to Wonder Girl's portion and added a love triangle there as well by introducing Wingo the Bird Boy. Because obviously it wouldn't make sense to have a younger Steve show up on Paradise Island, so here is a bird boy who also liked Wonder Girl, so of course she just liked him back by default. And Bird Boy will butt heads with Mer-Boy for Wonder Girl's affections, and we'll spend some issues stewing in the fact that Wonder Girl just can't choose between those two. And you better believe that an adult Bird-Man shows up at some point as well, so that our present-day love triangle becomes a love square, or possibly a love pentagon if you add Diana Prince into the mix, which I'm not sure whether that puts us over or under the usual amount of participants required for a reverse harem anime. Cause like, look, we know what's happening here, right? We today, as veteran connoisseurs of all sorts of genre conventions through the years, have seen all these tropes and gimmicks in 100,000 CW spin-offs of spin-offs. We've seen Bella making the fuss over choosing between Edward and Jacob. We've seen entire seasons of TV carried by the question of whether Rachel will choose Ross or Joey. We know who Kagome really loves, but also that the story would be over immediately if she just gave in and got together with Sesshomaru. You have to consider that the same romantic tropes that come across as tired and forced to us advanced future humans may have come across as charming and fresh 60 years ago. Or so I imagine. I mean, I assume Kanigher had some idea what his readers were into and wasn't just tossing in this stuff for his own benefit. Keep in mind as well that everything else in comics was also pretty bonkers in the 60s. We don't talk a lot these days about the transcendent meme that was Super Dickory, but lest we forget, around this time over in Superman's books, he was basically bullying Jimmy Olsen 24/7, while Lois Lane's favorite pastime was to cover herself in leaves and hope that Superman falls in so that she can force him to marry her. And that's the cast of Superman books on a good day. I mean, as exasperating as Steve Trevor and the Beastie Boys could be, I'm pretty sure that none of them have ever tried to murder Diana or vice versa, which at least puts them ahead of these guys. So anyway, yeah. Kanigher has his reputation of making Wonder Woman a bit too boy crazy, but in context we can also see what he was going for, and also that he was going for it pretty mildly by the standards of the time. But still, considering the sort of female hero that William Moulton-Marston wanted Wonder Woman to be, someone who could teach other women to stand up against men and to not let themselves be conquered by a handsome face, I can't imagine Marston would have been pleased at the notion of Princess Diana becoming so very lovesick, so very besotted with so many men in her life, so very overwhelmed by all her romantic troubles that it basically overcame every other aspect of her life. So that's something to consider. I think our big takeaway about Kanigher is that he was really into gimmicks, and he wasn't above turning Wonder Woman into a very gimmicky series if he thought that was what would sell issues. When romance comics started to get big, he steered Wonder Woman stories towards romance. When whimsical younger versions of characters became popular, he took that concept and ran the hell out of it. In other words, Kanigher feels like a very standard and successful comic book writer. Heck, he might have been what the standard of what a standard successful comic book writer of the time should be like. And so we ended up with a book that sure looks like Wonder Woman on the surface and may have even shared in her zany vibes, but also tended to be always grabbing ideas that other books had already done, which, for better or for worse, may have made Diana feel a bit more like every other hero around at the time. Which is definitely not how she came across to anyone back in Marston's hands, which may have led to this impression of Wonder Woman comics getting worse after Kanigher took over, even if he was just following very standard, time-worn Silver Age formulas, which were what they were. These comics were uniformly bright and loud and filled with spectacular events, and they were also quirky and comical and innocent fun for the whole family, where the only serious problem anyone ever had was them having to choose between 2 boys, or 3 or 4. They were Saturday morning cartoons, at the dawning of the Saturday morning cartoons age, and you had to figure that, if nothing else, at least Kanigher was giving the readers what they wanted, right? Like, this guy who had his finger on the comics pulse at all times must have just been catering to his audience, and the audience must not have wanted to think about serious issues anymore and just wanted harmless, brainless fun with Wonder Mom and Wonder Tot, right? All this more gimmicky, family-oriented entertainment must simply have been what the evolving face of comic book readership was asking for at the time, right? In Wonder Woman issues 130 and 132, published in 1962, we get to flash back to Hippolyta's past and see that before the Amazons went to their island, She actually got courted by Hercules on several occasions. Hercules is depicted here as an oafish buffoon and far below Hippolyta's standards, and the stories are mostly about him being comically humiliated by Hippolyta. But he's not at war with the Amazons here, and there's no indication that he ever would be, that he'll ever go on to trick and enslave these women like he infamously did in Marston's origin. The Amazons here in Hippolyta's flashback are already wearing their bracelets of submission, which means that in Kanigher's revised canon, they don't do so as a reminder of their subjugation by men, and indeed, if we go back to issue 105, we see that the Amazons didn't actually sequester themselves on Paradise Island as a reaction to being mistreated at all, but because, quote, all the men got wiped out in the wars, and they wanted to escape from those terrible wars. Basically, the entire inciting incident between Hercules and Hippolyta and the Amazons that Marston very purposefully placed in the first 4 pages of Wonder Woman's origin, because it comprises his whole outlook and thematic intent behind this character, just flat out didn't happen in the world of Kanigher's Wonder Woman. Let's be very clear, Kanigher knew about Marston's original backstory for the Amazons. He had referenced it back earlier in his run, and as we'll touch on, he will go on to reference it in future books. He knows this backstory very well. Whatever reason he might have had for, let's go ahead and call it sanitizing the Amazons' backstory so that it had far less violent themes, it absolutely wasn't because he didn't know about this backstory. It's also worth mentioning that Marston's backstory was certainly not all that graphic, especially not by our modern standards. While we understand today that there are deeper, more sinister implications of a nation of women being enslaved by Hercules and his men, none of that was shown in these original pages, and there's also otherwise no gore or blood or death. They almost come across as a cartoonified, sugar-coated version of a more graphic story. But even so, even as pared down and as reserved as this original 40s Marston backstory was, it still certainly comes across 100 times more graphic and adult than how Kanigher's version of Hippolyta and the Amazons and Hercules would interact in the 60s. A sneering strongman grabs a woman by the throat. There are mentions of beatings and torments. It's strong imagery that deals with strong themes, and even as a brightly colored cartoon, might be a bit unsettling for very young readers who aren't quite at the stage to understand that it is the darkness in stories like this that makes the light and heroism they depict all the more compelling. Or whatever. Alright, bear with me, if you will, as we briefly fast forward to issue 204 in 1973. It's been 11 years since we last saw Hercules' sanitized cartoon courtship of Hippolyta, and Kanigher had taken an almost 5-year break from the Wonder Woman series while it did its notorious white outfit mod phase, more on this later, but now he's back on this comic while it shuffles back to a more familiar status quo. So for plot reasons, Diana has lost her memories, and her mom straps her into the Matrix, she uses an Amazon memory machine to help her recover them. And here we then get to see the return of the original Amazon backstory in all its unsanitized glory. Men are screwing up the world, Aphrodite makes Amazons to counter them, Hercules tricks and enslaves the Amazons, Aphrodite helps them to escape, and then they head to Paradise Island and make Diana from clay. The only difference is that this is Kanigher's own blonde Hippolyta of all those zany, family-friendly 60s comics, being given the austerity and the adult context of the original brunette Marston Hippolyta. So Kanigher was clearly willing and able to depict this story, but there was a period of time when he simply didn't, or perhaps couldn't. There was a stretch of comics publication where he deliberately revised the Amazon's origin so that this very violent incident was excised entirely and replaced with the Amazons leaving man's world because of a generic war that they were generically sad about, while Hercules was just an inept brute played for laughs instead of gravitas. There was a time, which covers just about everything we talked about above with the Mer-Boys and the Wonder Children, where comics in general were being steered very deliberately towards being that sort of all-ages friendly product. The full history of the Comics Code Authority, the CCA, is far more complex and involved than we have time to cover here. At some point it involved the mob. And just so we're clear, the Comics Code was not some sort of enforced mandate that publishers had to legally comply by or else. It was never any sort of law or nationwide edict that censored the naughty bad things in comics. How it actually worked was that publishers would have the Comics Code review their comics, and the CCA would either approve of the books or not. The ones that passed got this seal of approval on their covers to show anyone who cared that these books abided by the CCA standards. The problem is that anyone who cared included basically all comics distributors, as in shops that people bought their books from, because no one wanted to be that store that parents thought were turning their children into juvenile delinquents. Other businesses also wouldn't advertise their products in comics that didn't get approved, because no one wanted to be the sleazy business that advertised their stuff in these pornographic pages. So while the CCA couldn't literally force publishers to get their comics reviewed or stop anyone from publishing comics without the CCA seal of approval, in practice, any publishers who wanted to sell books would pretty much just have to abide by these standards or else go out of business. Which did happen to many publishers even when they did abide by the code, because the more sanitized comics that they were forced to make weren't selling anymore. So first of all, yeah, it's not as if readers all of a sudden stopped wanting more mature content in their books. It's more that comic book creators literally had to tone down their content if they wanted their books on the racks at all. How toned down are we talking about? It's a long list, but for simplicity's sake, boils down to everything having to fall within sort of the higher G rating or pretty modest PG rating by today's standards. You can't have scenes of excessive violence, no torture or gore. You can't have salacious or sexual content. Illicit sex relations can't be portrayed or even hinted at, not even just seduction, much less nudity or perversion or sexual abnormalities. One of the first things it mentions is that crimes shall never be presented in such a way as to create sympathy for the criminal, to promote distrust of the forces of law and justice, or to inspire others with a desire to imitate criminals. I mean, we can obviously see the moralistic, goodly intent behind not wanting children to do crime or disrespect their elders, but we can also see the Orwellian tone implicit here of not being ever able to criticize the establishment in any story, right? All police officers, judges, and politicians have to always be portrayed as the good guys if you wanted your comic to see the light of day. That's the thing. All of this stuff basically came about as a result of moral panic, and a moral panic always starts as something that seems pretty sensible. Of course, you don't want to glorify crime and criminals in something that primarily children read. Of course, you don't want nudity in your Supergirl books or Archie comics. What, you want sex, Archie? You want Betty to be flashing her whole ass in a Barnes & Nobles? Of course not. Probably. Content censorship always starts by honing in on seemingly sensible precautions that any sensible person should want. The problem is that even the most seemingly sensible moral sentiments tend to snowball into subjective hypercriticism and false equivalencies, pretty much without exception, when you try to codify what people are or aren't allowed to see. Look, we know the score, right? I feel like we today are pretty well versed in what moral panic is and the sorts of unreasonable fears that can give rise to them and the sorts of fear-mongering and real harm that can come out of people just trying to look out for the children. It's always, always, always about the children. We gotta protect the children from all the bad stuff and from learning the wrong things, which, yeah, we should. That is a good thing to want to do. And it's that sort of mindset that originally drove Dr. Frederick Wertham in his works. Wertham is best known for writing Seduction of the Innocent in 1954, which was a big instigating force behind the CCA in making the general public think that reading comics is going to turn their children into drug dealers and so forth. Nowadays, he's mostly remembered as a sort of old-fashioned, silly boogeyman figure in comic circles who thought Batman and Robin were homosexual deviants and that Wonder Woman was a lesbian because she was powerful and independent. And he told everyone that if your children read these comics, then they would turn into those things too. Now, obviously, there is no doubt in my mind that Wertham's works and the CCA in general had an overall net negative influence on the social political spectrum. That being said, kind of our whole point here is that real world events and real life people aren't just black or just white. See, Wertham was originally considered a progressive psychologist who worked with underprivileged children in Harlem, and some of his studies helped end national segregation laws. Which, hey, yeah, good on him. Wertham very famously did not even like the Comics Code Authority, and as we'll see, the way it ended up being implemented will end up going against Wertham's own sentiments, even though he's the one who whipped everyone up into this frenzy in the first place. Either way, it's because Wertham did work so closely with troubled youths and issues of delinquency that he noticed that a whole bunch of these children read comic books, which translated into him believing that comic books were the common denominator that made children more troubled and prone to delinquency. This, as we know, is commonly known nowadays as a false equivalency, and it's the sort of false equivalency that is so prevalent with moral panic. If you only work with troubled children, sure, it might seem like a whole bunch of them read comics, therefore comics lead to troubles. But comics at the time were just really popular with children, period, whether they were troubled or not. So how does your thesis account for the tens of thousands of children who grew up on this stuff and turned into upstanding citizens? You know what a lot of troubled children also probably did growing up? They also probably drank milk. Does that mean drinking milk leads to criminal behavior? I mean, the numbers are there, right? Again, all this sort of discourse is obviously old hat to us nerds at this point. Yeah, it sure sounds theoretically, psychologically reasonable that seeing violent entertainment leads to violent mindsets, right? How can that be wrong? At bare minimum, it must desensitize you to violence, right? Watching people beat people up must make you personally more okay with beating people up. Playing violent video games where you shoot people or stab people a lot must make you more okay with shooting or stabbing people, right? Something so reasonable and logical can't possibly be wrong, right? Well, it actually is just wrong. The pure simple fact is that there is flat out no measurable correlation between the media that children consume and the type of behavior that they exhibit, the type of person that they become. Some people who watched Power Rangers as children might maybe be more violent. The rest of them will not. Literal decades of in-depth study on this subject has not been able to determine what kind of person you will become from the books, movies, and games that you experience. And the only reason it took decades to determine that they couldn't determine this was because people wouldn't let it go. They just couldn't accept these facts. It's much more convenient to believe that having guns in video games will lead to school shootings as opposed to, the real actual guns that someone has. I know that this section has already run for far longer than it should have, but I also want to put a bit of context to the actual harm that the CCA did instead of just gesturing at it in vagaries like, ooh, censoring bad things is bad. Well, why is it bad? It's a bit puritanical and prudish, but why is it specifically bad to not have adult content in children's books? Because adult content is a very flexible term that can mean anything, and most usually means things that certain people in positions of power just flat out don't like. By labeling anything you simply don't like as adult or graphic, you have an excuse to excise those things from public view, deeming them as somehow shameful or pornographic. In 1956, EC Comics wanted to reprint one of their older pre-Comics Code stories from Weird Fantasy issue 18, titled Judgment Day. In this story, a human astronaut meets an alien robot race that segregates themselves based on color and basically treats blue robots worse than orange robots, even though there's literally no difference between the robots other than their outer color. The human astronaut determines that this robot race is not advanced enough to join the greater Galactic Republic until they treat all robots equally. The final panel of the comic is the astronaut removing his helmet and revealing that he is a black man. Reminder, this comic was originally published in 1953, 1 year before the code had been established, and EC Comics just wanted to reprint it 3 years later in a newer issue. The CCA rejected this issue, with its administrator Judge Charles Murphy ordering EC Comics to change the central character so that he wasn't black anymore. So if you'll recall, there's nothing in the comics code that says you can't show black people, because that would be insane. The ruling was completely groundless, even by the CCA's own standards. So why was it made? Well, the easy answer would be that Charles Murphy might have just been super racist and used his position of power to try and censor a story that promoted racial equality. Alternatively, or perhaps additionally, Murphy might just have not liked comics in general and exploited the issue of race as a convenient excuse to hamper this company's publications. EC Comics owner William Gaines was quoted to have said that the CCA was just generally out to get them, harassing their company to try to put them out of business. Slight sidebar, EC Comics was actually pretty notable in its time for its stories being very socially progressive, with anti-war themes and stories decrying the Holocaust and so forth, so we'll put that in the context pile as well. Gaines then threatened Judge Murphy with lawsuits, saying that he would tell the press all about this situation, and Murphy did relent and allowed the unaltered comic to bear their precious CCA seal of approval. Unfortunately, the issue would still end up being the last that EC Comics would print, as they just couldn't keep up sales with these ever-increasing restrictions. So, we can see that this Charles Murphy guy was a big racist asshole, and that's certainly a problem, but it's not the only problem. Sure, Gaines and his company threatened to make enough of a fuss to get around this one case of censorship, but this was just the second year of the Comics Code Authority's existence. Even if you replaced Murphy with any other guy, which, didn't happen, EC Comics might have been gone, but Murphy was still there, just doing his thing. Either way, the system that he exploited is also still right there anyway, being just as exploitable as ever. Never mind that it was used to basically bully a publication company out of business. Right from the outset, the CCA was abusing its already really strict prohibitions to just censor anything that they didn't like, whether it actually hurt children or not, which in this case turned out to be seeing a black man. The problem, you see, is that if you're in a position of enough power and have enough moral panic backing you up, you can declare that just about anything in the world can hurt children, and hey, guess what? Because you are in a position of power that was built on evidence-free fear-mongering, the things that you think will hurt children will almost always just so happen to be demographics who are not in positions of power, also usually known as minorities. In this case, again, the thing that the CCA thought would hurt children happened to be a black man, but I know y'all were paying attention earlier when we talked about it prohibiting illicit sexual relations and sexual abnormalities, and I know that y'all understood that they meant lesbians, homosexuals, transgender people. To reiterate, nothing in the code outright said that you couldn't show a gay person, in the same way that nothing in it said that characters had to be a certain race sometimes. But that was absolutely how the code was understood and how it was enforced, to marginalize these demographics that were already marginalized, to make them even less visible than they already were, to hurt the exact kinds of people who are already hurting them most. We get it, right? We've been through all of this many times now. We've seen it before, we're still seeing it now. Moral panic always begins with some very reasonable incentive of protecting children somehow, and then always, without exception, ends up targeting the type of people that fundamentalist establishment has always hated and feared. Nowadays, the officials advocating for censorship, for restricting education, for controlling what young people can learn about or read about or hear about, have almost given up even the pretense of hiding bigotry behind bureaucracy, and have been more or less pretty upfront about the fact that they just want to hurt black people or hurt trans people. But then, perhaps these types of people have always been pretty upfront about it. Lest we forget, a whole lot of other iffy moral panic stuff was also going on in the 50s, including the whole Red Scare and widespread McCarthyist fear-mongering that probably fed into CCA sentiments and vice versa. In any case, both the HUAC and the CCA's authority would slowly fade away through the years. It wasn't a particularly exciting victory of the forces of art triumphing over censorship like you might see in a movie dramatization or something. These regressive institutions never faced any resounding defeat in a court of law or some big finishing blow. times simply changed and people simply stopped being as beholden to dated standards of what could or couldn't be portrayed. Still, I feel like we today definitely still feel the lingering after effects of decades of comics and movies being held under regressive standards of censorship, and the institutions still tend to kowtow to such standards as the prevailing default. Even on our best days when we're not outright censoring harmless demographics, we're still cycling through the age-old mindsets that are so completely certain that violent video games and violent comic books are the cause of society's downfall. And in regards to that, all I can think of is this tweet here dropping the truth bomb that Fox News did to our parents what they thought video games would do to us. What the fuck does any of this have to do with Wonder Woman? Well, it's actually easy to see how all this context is important to everything we've talked about, right? Would Kanigher have ended up writing Wonder Woman any differently if the comics code hadn't been around? I mean, there was no code when Kanigher started writing Wonder Woman comics, and then there was, so by definition, anything Kanigher wrote after that fact would have had to have been molded by the code, catered to the code, or else it wouldn't have gotten published. So while he was no doubt chasing sales with the choices he made, he also had to make these choices according to newly sanitized standards. And so this book having a more sanitized Hercules, more sanitized Hippolyta, sanitized Amazons, and everything else certainly makes a lot more sense. Kanigher didn't craft this Wonder Woman family with their familial, child-friendly tone that parents would be okay with their children reading about just as a sales-driven gimmick. It was also one of the few sales-driven gimmicks that would be allowed under these new rules. Throwing boy after boy at Wonder Girl and then man after man at Wonder Woman might just have been Kanigher pandering to romance tropes, and it might also have been him making absolutely certain that everyone knew Wonder Woman was definitely not an icky lesbian just because she came from an island of women. Oh no, look at all her husbandos, how much straighter can you get? All of which was like, again, considering that the whole point of Wonder Woman was to be a feminist hero, I think we can make a pretty fair case that forcibly attaching this type of fundamentalist heteronormative identity onto this character for as long as they did, well, did a bit more harm to her than it might have done towards other characters like Superman or Batman. Like, sure, this was also happening at the time, but people look back on Batman's campy years as somehow charming, as something that ultimately added to the character and his world. I don't know that anyone looks back on the Wonder family and their boy toys as anything other than an unfortunate temporary hindrance on this character's full potential, which is unfortunate. And this state of things was just how it would be for a while, mostly.